Sure. Well, I've just put up one of our fossil fish in the collection in the UK up on the screen. It was a great group of people who ended up purchasing this fish and donating it to us. You can see big fish and you can see little fish, and you can see little fish coming out of big fish's mouth. Now, one thing you know for sure, no matter how you interpret this, it didn't take a long while to actually form. I mean, you can see some incredible detail from the scales to the bones to the well, actually, it's interesting that you can see the bones because even though this is a squashed fish, it is a 3D fish. It's just not very thick, just like the big fish that John held up earlier, which you can clearly see the fish has been squashed. Not quite as squashed as these guys from the Green River Formation in Wyoming, but it's a 3D fish. All the components are there, including the gut content. You know this because, well, if you look closely in the middle of the fish, you can actually see there's part of a smaller fish's vertebrae still inside the stomach. Now, when we first found this fish, and you'll see other examples of fish like this around the world, they're often interpreted as being halfway through eating a fish. But if you look very, very closely on the fish as we get into some more detail, right, have a look on little fish. Because if you look at big fish's mouth, you can see the teeth. And if you have a look at little fish's back, you can start to see the teeth marks as well, just along the back of it, where it's partially decayed. Well, it would certainly appear that this is a little fish that has been previously eaten, but before it's even had chance to properly digest, big fish has been caught up and has been squashed so suddenly and so violently that little fish has gone bloop and has come out of the mouth, right? Now, John, I know that you have a similar fish in Australia. This is one of your big slabs. I suspect it's going to be in the museum now. It's on the same location, the Green River Formation, but have a look at the fish up the top. You see big fish, you see little fish, you see how little fish is coming out of big fish's mouth. The only difference really is that little fish is slightly more digested. This is fossil vomit. Well, vomit is what? Soft and slippery and gungy and gross. And this is a fish in a watery environment. And yes, when fish vomit under normal environments, it just dissipates, it floats away, it dissolves into the water. The fact that this has actually been captured like this means that big fish has been caught up in a slurry of sediment before being squashed and buried, forcing the vomit out of its mouth, but the vomit has nowhere to go. And the end result is a beautiful snapshot of a vomiting fish that's been forced to vomit. Okay, again, it's a fast fossil. There's no way that this takes vast periods of time. There's no way it takes even short periods of time. This is an instantaneous amount of preservation. Beautiful details. Beautiful vomit, really. It's almost pretty to look at now, but it's fast for sure. But you see, here's your problem. The standard assumption, the standard association, if you go around to museums, if you read in books, we've got examples of this from natural history museums around the world, is that when fish, in order rather to get a fish fossil, fish die and sink to the bottom of the lake or the pond or the river. Well, here's your first problem, and anybody who's watched Crocodile Dundee will know this as well. When fish die, generally speaking, they bloat and they float. They bloat and they float for a simple reason. A lot of fish have got swim bladders. It's what controls their buoyancy. Once you're dead, you've got no control over your swim bladder, and so the gases ferment and expand, and as a result, you end up with a floating fish that then gets washed ashore, and then very quickly, you end up with a fish that gets destroyed and decomposed, and hey, that looks absolutely nothing like that fossil fish. Certainly got no vomit coming out of its mouth, and all the scales are rotting and decaying, and you've got no detail really at all. So if you want to get a fossil fish, first principle is you need to quickly catch it up with sediment and quickly bury it, certainly then squashing it to produce the Green River Formation fish, which are vomiting or throwing up a recently eaten meal. Well, what was John talking about? Well, one of the criticisms we started to get fairly soon after we started using these as an example, and the example certainly still stands, but the argument is, well, not all fish do have a swim bladder. And in fact, under some conditions, you can actually have the fish sink to the bottom of the sea or the river or the tank. And we looked into it, and it's true. Under some conditions, you can have the fish sink to the bottom of the sea. Namely, if it's very cold water, it usually doesn't give the chance to expand, and so you end up with a fish sinking to the bottom. And the argument was, well, if some fish do sink to the bottom, then you can have fish form very slowly.
Nope.
Well, we were actually giving this presentation, and it was actually in Australia. And after I'd finished giving a presentation, a fish farmer came up to me and said, you know what? You're absolutely right. I'm a fish farmer. I keep my fish in cold water tanks. And when a fish dies, it doesn't float. It actually sinks to the bottom. And it's a race against time to get that fish out. And I said, why? Well, he said, what happens when the fish sinks to the bottom of the sea is, oops, I forgot that bit. There we are. Is this happens. The fungus, which is existing on the bottom of the tank, in the bottom of the river, in the bottom of the sea, actually comes up and attaches itself to the fish and begins to digest it. In fact, this fungus will go one step further. It will actually anchor that fish to the bottom of the tank as it's digesting it, and it will contaminate the entire tank. So we need to get that fish out very quickly. In fact, sometimes even if the fish is not doing very well or is not very healthy, the fungus will actually start to decompose even while the fish is still swimming around, because it specifically attacks hard to digest things like keratin, which is a form of plastic. In fact, there's lots of other hard to digest silica-rich plants like seaweed and stuff that this fungus also digest. So again, you can see it has a different use in a very good world. In a fallen world like today, it attacks and digests keratin and fish and scales. And just within a few hours, this fish begins to be destroyed. So again, you really have no means of producing a fish fossil slowly. Certainly no means of getting anything that resembles a fish, and even less chance of a fish fossil forming slowly to get beautiful details like scales. And you've got absolutely no chance of a slow fish fossil capturing the details of vomit and regurgitating fish. If you want a fish fossil, you need to bury it quickly, deeply, without the presence of oxygen, and with the right process. And that really is the key point. It's about a process. Get the right process, you get a fossil fish. Get the wrong process, well, it's not just a case of get the wrong process, it takes millions of years, because if you get the wrong process and it does take millions of years, or even tens of years, or even 1 year, or even a few weeks, you will end up with no fossil at all, because time is your biggest enemy when it comes to creating and producing a fossil. If you have too much time, time will destroy your creature or organism long before you've got a chance to fossilize it. If you want to create a good fossil, you need the right process, and that process must be fast. As John has said many times, and it's worth repeating again, slow fossils are no fossils. It simply doesn't work.
Looking at one of those fossils yesterday that Joe had up, and you told me how many fish have been found in that Wyoming fish formation. That's evidence in itself, isn't it? How many was that?
If you look at the Wyoming fish deposits, which is where so many of the world's fossil fish collections, particularly the little herrings, and you may be interested in knowing that those fossil fish herrings in Wyoming are actually our Australian Murray River herrings today that live in the Murray River. So Australia does not have unique flora and fauna at all. But there's a band, particularly the 18-inch band, which is a commercial band, and you can go and quarry it with a certain fee. But the number of fossils per square mile is in the millions, right? Yes. It's just unbelievable. So it's definitely catastrophic. It's definitely a limited size deposit, but it's definitely been catastrophic. To give you an idea of what we mean by non-global catastrophic beds, I've collected all through the mountains of eastern Washington, and you find many volcanic beds. I've got beautifully preserved fossil leaves from previous Mount St. Helens eruptions. The trees were hit, the leaf was blasted up into space, came down, covered up with cooler ash, and beautifully preserved leaf bed today. catastrophic for sure, but are limited, maybe half a state or a whole state, but that's it. The same is true with the Wyoming beds, but they are evidence that slow fossils is no fossils. There's no way to avoid it.
Having been to the Green River Formation and digging fossils in the in a quarry there, we dug in just a small area, maybe 10 feet along the quarry wall, and we found over 100 fish in just that one little section. And going back in depth, we only went back maybe a foot to 2 foot back. Very small area, is just hundreds of fish. I'll also say that, having worked on EH is oxidation reduction reactions in swamps and in waters, is, you get nutrients into the water, the algae just picks up and just becomes active. You get an algae bloom, your DO levels go down to zero, you get a fish kill. That's the process. Well, having grown up in Louisiana and having a father who was a fisherman in the Atchafalaya Basin, I can tell you what happens when you have a major storm event. You get down trees, vegetation into the water, and the DO levels will go down within a day. And you have a major fish kills. I've been through there after a hurricane where you've got the down trees and just mats of just floating fish, major fish kills. In fact, after one hurricane, the aquatic biologists were saying the Atchafalaya Basin is not going to recover. It's a total wipeout of the fish within no time, though afterwards, amazing how they were restored. But that's the process. You have a major global flood event, sediment being pumped into the waters, nutrients for the first time running off into these waters. You're going to have just major drop in the DO levels, major fish kills, at the same time that you've got all this sediment burying the fish.
Yeah. But of course, the big difference now is if you go to that swamp area, can you dig up fossils of all of those fish that died?
No. Because if you have any fish that dies while all the others are still alive, that's why we call those bait. The other fish are eating on them. I've snorkeled many places around the globe. I've even scuba dived down the Great Barrier Reef. You don't see dead fish laying around on the bottom, laying there waiting for sediment to come and bury them.
So it's not just, you don't just need a mechanism to kill the things.
You need a mechanism to bury them
very quickly. So we're dealing with a slurry of sediment flowing in water, capturing these creatures and burying them down and squashing them flat very, very quickly.
Yes.
And it has to be the right kind of sediment as well.
Yeah.
Because if it's a hard sand, what's that going to do to the fish? It's just going to shred it to pieces.
Yes.
So it needs to be the right process. It's not just the water. It's not just the rapid flowing water. It's the right sediment that's in the water that's burying these creatures as it goes, whether it's a global scale, whether it's a smaller catastrophe, whether it's an ash flow, whatever it is, it needs to be the right process.
That's right.